In this video, we're going to be taking a look at one of my favorite poems by one of America's favorite poets. Welcome to a reading, summary, and analysis of Billy Collins's Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light, like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So that poem obviously takes quite a dramatic turn. And in poetry, there's this term called volta, which literally in Italian means turn. And it happens when there is a shift in thought or theme in a piece of poetry. Now, typically, we think of a volta as a sonnet term. It's really just used in sonnets, and it's usually in a pretty specific location. However, I have found the term useful to think about when reading most poetry, even poetry that isn't a sonnet, because a lot of poems take a turn or a shift in direction. And this poem obviously does. Where the volta, the unofficial volta, would be located is quite obvious, I think. It is right before the second to last stanza. So when we're talking about this piece, I'm going to refer to the top half of the poem as the stanzas above that yellow line and the bottom half as the final two, even though I know that's not the halfway point. So as we think about this piece as a whole, before we get into that, let's talk about the speaker and the audience. The speaker is handing a poem out to a group of people, and you can probably figure out that just about the only people who do that, only people who ask other groups of people to read poetry, are teachers and professors. So I kind of picture this in a classroom setting. And in the top half of the poem, we have all this beautiful, adventurous, sort of fun, exciting images of what to do with a poem. We have holding it up like a color slide, or listening to it, or dropping a mouse in and watching him find his way out of a maze, etc., etc. And a lot of these images play into senses. We have looking at the poem through the light like a color slide, and listening at a hive, or feeling the walls for the light switch. So a lot of sense imagery. And there's also some really exciting ones like the mouse and the maze, or water skiing and waving at the author's name. I really like that image. In the second half of the poem, that bottom half, the images are visceral and intense and torturous. Instead of adventure, it's tying it to a chair and torturing a confession out of it. We're left with this image of the poem being brutalized in order to figure out what information it's holding. So obviously Collins is using metaphor here, and if we think back to the sort of speaker audience of the poem as students receiving a piece, what this seems to be saying here in the bottom half is that what students want to do, or the average student wants to do with a poem, is treat it almost like a math equation, that you just sit it down and you work through it as fast as you can until you get an answer. And I, as a teacher myself, I've seen this in the classroom, the idea that you just read a poem once and you figure out something from it and then just move on, or you just look up what it means on the internet without ever reading it all to begin with. And this idea of what a poem really means is a very flawed question. And I know as a teacher, I have asked this question before, and I try and catch myself to not do so, because poems don't have a set meaning that you have to unlock. Some poems have advice, and some poems tell stories, and some poems just offer observation, but they are not meant to guide our lives or have this sort of meaning that we have to figure out from them and just move on and write down on a worksheet or a test. They're really pieces of art. They're a collection of images through words. And you would never go to an art museum and just stare at a painting and say, oh, what does this one mean? Got it? Okay, move on. Okay, maybe some people do that. Or more likely, they take a selfie with the painting and then move on. But the point remains that the fun of going to an art museum is looking at the art closely. It's appreciating the technique. It's taking the time to see the details and the background, or the shape that the painting has. And likewise, a poem is meant to be explored. It's meant to be a fun read. They're short most of the time because you can read them over and over again and learn more and more about it each time and enjoy exploring the poem. So these images from the top half, what does that look like in a classroom? If we're trying to create this as teachers or as readers of poetry or as students who have to read poetry and want a more positive experience with it, what do these images look like? Well, I don't think they each correlate to a direct activity, but there's a lot of different things we can do with poetry that are more fun than just reading it through and figuring out what it means and moving on. First off, I think we have to avoid being formulaic when it comes to poetry. One of the ways I was taught to read poetry was called TP Cats, and each one of the letters stood for something. You're supposed to follow this exact formula. It was like title and paraphrase and context, annotate, something, something, go back to the title, summarize. And all of those are very useful, but turning a poem into a formula can really strip the joy out of it. The other thing we need to remember when we're trying to better enjoy poetry is that we need to read it widely. When I hear people say to me that they don't like poetry, I understand that. There was a time in my life I didn't like poetry, but it kind of triggers the same sort of feeling as if someone were to say they don't like television or they don't like movies. And yeah, there's people out there that don't, but for the most part, everyone can find something that they like on TV at some point. And the key to this is they've watched enough to figure out what they like. Could you imagine if Netflix was a subject in school and instead of you getting to browse through it and pick exactly what you wanted to watch and try things out and give up on them and switch to another one till you find something that you really are committed to, could you imagine if a teacher just assigned you 5 Netflix shows to watch? Just 5. Those are the only ones you ever watch that whole year. Just the 5. And it's what the teacher thinks are important. And most likely they're old and they're really complicated. And you probably don't have the foundational media literacy to quite grasp them yet. But that's all you get. If that was the scenario, there'd be a lot of people that don't like Netflix. If that was the only TV you could ever watch in a year is what your teacher gave to you, then that would be a very limited view. And I'm not saying teachers shouldn't assign poetry, but oftentimes, at least in the United States school system, we have Poetry Month or Poetry Unit. So we do this little bit of sprinkling of poetry and then we move on to something else. I try and teach poetry throughout the year because I find that works much better for students and it can tie into almost anything you're talking about. You can find a poem that works with it. One of my favorite poems is about cutting the grass, for Pete's sake. There's poetry about everything. So if your teacher's not giving you lots of options, then dive into a website like the Poetry Foundation or pick up a collection of poetry and just browse through it till you find something you like. So to say you don't like poetry might be you don't like poetry yet because you haven't found poetry that speaks to you at this moment in time. And for teachers, I think we need to understand the need to give lots of diverse poems from diverse authors and different subject matters because all of our students are different and they might not be ready for the sonnets or the romantics or the Victorian narrative poems yet. But if something else sparks their interest, like a Billy Collins poem, for instance, maybe they will be. Another way we can stay on the top half of this poem when it comes to reading it in the classroom or on our own is to use it as fuel for our own creativity. One of the really fun things about poetry is trying to emulate it, to figure out how the poet is using syllables and images and metaphors and alliteration and trying to create your own piece of poetry based on that, sort of like a prompt. And that's really how all great poets start or all great artists of anything start is being derivative by copying the stuff they like. So the natural follow through from reading widely is to start writing your own. And it doesn't have to be poems that are published. It doesn't have to be poems that are shared with anyone. They can be very therapeutic on their own. But I'd encourage you, if you do write poetry, to find places where you can share it and people that will give you genuine feedback, because I think it's a beautiful thing that a lot of people would benefit more from. And there's a lot of people who are very excited to meet, especially younger people who write poetry. And then a final note here that I think we really have to keep in mind before we get too romantic about this idea of the top half of the poem is that not all of those ideas, taken in a literal sense, are necessarily immediately rewarding and fun. If I think of my own classroom, if I brought a mouse into it for us to drop into a maze, it would be a very memorable day. But I would absolutely have students standing on chairs and screaming, and some students who probably just run out of the room and go right to the parking lot. So these are not easy things necessarily. Water skiing, for instance. Water skiing is not fun the first time you water ski. it has an incredibly high learning curve. The first time you water ski, that is called being dragged by a boat and eating lake. That's not skiing whatsoever. But if you put the work in and you put the time into it, it's an incredible thing to zip across the water on a small piece of wood being pulled by a boat. And people who are professional at it can do amazing things with water skiing. So my point in all of this is that to truly appreciate poetry, there is work involved. There is multiple readings. There's looking up words you don't know. There's coming up with ideas and theories that are wrong or just not supported by the text. And dare I say it, there's annotating and taking a roadmap of where you're walking through the poem. And there's looking at a poem again 5 years later and looking at your annotations and laughing, but also being excited about how much better you are at reading poetry now than you used to be. So Introduction to Poetry, I think, is a wonderful reminder. It's a great way to start a poetry unit if that's what you're doing, or even the school year itself, because it works for both the students and the teachers. That poetry should, sounds a little corny, but it should be fun. And if you can find a way to make it fun, most people will get hooked on it. Most people will learn to love it. And I think for most of us, it's a good addition to our reading habits and our everyday lives. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in hearing me talk about more poems as well as all things literature, feel free to subscribe or like the video. I'd really appreciate both. And happy reading. I'll see you in the next one.